Is society fairer when everyone is the same or when everyone is different? Can too much unity and equality actually destroy a society? Is absolute equality desirable? Would you care about something if it wasn't yours or if you didn't create it yourself? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the part 3 of the series that I'm doing on Aristotle's Politics. In the past 2 episodes, we covered the book 1 and we completed the book 1. We focused on the natural progression of societies, communities, from individual to village, and then ultimately to the city as a self-sufficient entity. We covered the natural hierarchies according to Aristotle's theory. We discussed about how money emerges, how commerce and trade emerged in societies. So these were initial topics about how human societies emerge. So far, uh, Aristotle hasn't touched upon the specifics of how governments work, how different regimes come into being. And starting from book 2, we are slowly entering into that territory where we are going to explore different governments, different societies, and different regimes in practice. A couple of brief words about this before I start. If you find this interesting, if you find this series useful, valuable, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing with your friends as well. I'm going to do more series on other books once this is completed. I also have a couple of podcast episodes coming up in the future. We will focus on different aspects: philosophy, history, AI, technology, economy, with very well-known names in those topics. But coming back to this specific part, sometimes I take a lot of time to release these episodes. I can't do them more often because I take my time to create these, read the chapters carefully so that I do not misrepresent any ideas or topics explored in the book. That's why I try to be responsible before I present these ideas. I take a lot of time to read these, and usually I rely on my own understanding of these books, of these chapters. I don't consult third party third party sources a lot. So this is my own interpretation of the main ideas and topics explored in the book. That's why I take time. I can't release them more often, but I try to do them at least once a week. So book 2 is really the chapter, is a part where Aristotelian understanding of world and Aristotelian approach to philosophy shines. This is the part of the book where we see the major departure of Aristotle from Plato's ideas, his beloved teacher Plato. If you look at that famous painting, famous Renaissance painting by Raphael, you will see that Plato is pointing upwards while Aristotle is pointing downwards. And I think Raphael clearly summed up the distinction between these two men's philosophies. Plato is always searching for the eternal truth, eternal system, perfect system. But this is where it is different from what his student Aristotle focuses on. He's much more grounded on empirical world. He's looking at the world, practical world, trying to understand what already exists in the nature and getting the knowledge from what is existing in the nature. You can also think of it from ideas versus what is already existing in the nature, whether ideas or material world matter more with regards to getting the knowledge. Where do we get the knowledge from? Is it from our thoughts, our speculations, and our theories that we build upon, or whether we first go out to nature, observe the nature, so more empirical understandings? That's where the biggest difference between these two great Greek philosophers lie. Even though Aristotle was Plato's student and he is highly influenced by Plato, his ideas, his theories are very original, and also his approach is very empirical, grounded. So that's why when you read Aristotle, you see this tension a lot, where he's always looking at the empirical evidence, and that's why he is not too theoretical. compared to Plato. Okay, before we explain how cities emerge, yes, first, male and female getting together as a natural process. They build families, households, and there is a natural ruling and ruled element. As a result of this natural progress, then households extend into villages, and then villages extend into cities. And the city is final natural community where city is self-sufficient. Its members trade, engage in different specialities, and as a result, this is a self-sufficient entity. Go check out the previous episodes if you want these topics explained in more detail, because I'm just giving a summary and I will skip ahead to the today's topic. We also discussed how money emerges in societies as trade emerges, and how money making is natural when it is connected to the purpose, specific purpose, whether it is getting your natural needs or creating something out of nothing. Book 2 starts with very interesting question. He says, let's start investigating what would be the best regime for people to live in. What would be the best political community for humans to be living in, to flourish as individuals? He says we need to look at the empirical evidence first. We need to look at actual regimes that exist already first. And also we need to criticize or evaluate those people that praise some of these regimes or criticize some of these regimes. So he's saying, let's first, before we create a theory, let's first understand what regimes are there and what other philosophers first came up with some ground theories before we create our own theory. And mostly he is making a reference to Plato, his teacher, because this is the chapter where he's going to heavily criticize his teacher, Plato. So before we go into explaining what specifically he criticizes, let me just give you a quick summary of what Plato advocated. If you need to explore this, go check Plato's book, The Republic, where it is essentially dialogue between Socrates and his contemporary thinkers, let's say. In this book, Plato first starts with trying to understand what justice is, and then comes up with a theory of a city where justice can be realized. And he ends up proposing a society where there are guardians, there are farmers, there are artisans. They're very strictly differentiated from one another. Guardians rule, they get the education, they share the children, they share wives, husbands. So it is very, very strictly governed society. And that's where this is the theory that Aristotle criticizes a lot in book 2. This part starts with very interesting question. Okay, in a city, should citizens share everything, nothing, or maybe just some things? He says absolute sharing of everything, property, wives, husband, children, is unrealistic. So let's start with some things that can be shared already. And he gives one single example, location. He says shared space is what all the citizens share in one single city. So this is the starting point. City is a place where its citizens share shared space, basically. Some geographically restricted location that's called city, and its citizens share this part. And that's natural and necessary. And then the question is, would it be fair if everyone in this city shared everything? Not just the location, but if they just shared everything in the society. And then he makes a specific claim. Is the regime described in the Republic by Plato fair? He says Socrates, but this part is very difficult to understand, because if you read the Republic, it is basically dialogue between Socrates and the other people. And it's always a question whether these were Socrates' ideas or it was Plato speaking through Socrates. But Aristotle was a student of Plato, so most likely it is the case that he got these ideas from Plato, but he here specifically refers to Socrates. He's saying, okay, the regime that is described by Socrates in the Republic, is it fair? Is it fair that people share everything together? That's what makes Aristotle a really great philosopher, is that we have this big book, Politics. Before he comes up with his own theories, He first goes back to what has already been said by other philosophers, and then he compares the feasibility of this theory in the light of empirical evidence. And that's what essentially book two is about. His immediate first investigation is to understand whether the republic suggested by Plato is realistic or not. First criticism. He says that Socrates does not clearly specify how it can be possible to have a regime where women and children are shared. Again, here's an insistence on empiricism, classic Aristotelian understanding. It sounds good in theory that people share everything together, but how can this be really the case? There isn't specific guidelines, understanding in the Republic how it can come into being. And then he makes a bold claim. He says too much unity, too much centralization is to be avoided in the regimes. Because if there is too much unity, too much centralization in a community, in the government, then it is basically not a city, but a household. We are going back in natural development of communities. According to Aristotle, natural development of communities always starts from more unified to less unified, less diverse to more diverse. And then it stops at city because city is self-sufficient entity. He's saying if the city is too centralized, we will be destroying what makes a city different than household and village. It is diversity because city is made up of people who are completely different from one another. They are not equal. Same person cannot be shoemaker or carpenter. They cannot be unified into one, let's say, citizen where they share every skill, every talent, every education. This is not practical. Same person cannot be farmer or hunter. In cities, there is a specialization because one person is carpenter, another person is shoemaker, another person is farmer. They focus on these specialities and they trade with one another. And as a result, in this one city itself is self-sufficient because its members are specialized in different talents, different skills. He says the push for unity, pushing these people to be the same and equal would destroy the city because people are different in their abilities and interests. And the city is not one single unity, as Socrates claims. It is aggregation of its members. It is multiplication of all its members into one entity. And this is not a singular entity. It is basically you add people up and you bring them to one shared location, and then that is city. So if our aim when we build cities, when we build nations, countries, is to have a self-sufficient entity, self-sufficient unity that can govern itself, that can have an army, economy, diplomacy, trade, then what is less of a unity is more choice-worthy than what is more of a unity. He also makes this claim that city does not arise from persons who are similar. This is in sharp contrast to what Plato speaks through Socrates in their book Republic, where it is basically people share, guardians share their husbands, their wives, their property. There is no private property. There is no poetry. Everyone has strict rules, strict responsibilities in society. And you cannot break these hierarchies, basically. And the idea is that it leads to unity, extreme unity, because happiness of the city itself as a singular unity is more important than the happiness of one of its members. This is what Plato was suggesting. Propaganda would be pushed to people so that they would have singular opinion about the things. But Aristotle says that it's impractical. You cannot push for unity because city itself, what makes city different than household and family and village is that its members are diverse. They have different thoughts, different skills, different abilities. And if you push for extreme centralization, you are turning that natural progress that we talked about in episode 1 from household to village to city, you're turning it backwards. You're going back because ultimately more diversity in city itself is more choice-worthy. And it has a lot of modern implications if you think about it. Aristotle would strongly would strongly oppose excessive central authority in a form of single party system that, let's say, tries to inhibit single point of view in among its citizens, equality of the thought. He says this can destroy the purpose of the city. Point of city is that each person is different, each person has different skills and views, and when you aggregate them all, you get one self-sufficient entity that is city, and that makes the city different and strong. But extreme unity would destroy the city in the long run. And in a way, this is a criticism of totalitarianism from rational point of view, not simply from moral point of view. He's saying that this is going to destroy city in the long run because city is not a household and its strength lies in diversity of roles, professions, and perspectives of its citizens. But then he says, let's take a step back. Okay, let's just imagine that it is true that possible community is the one that resembles the unity the most. Even if everyone is presented to be everyone's son, property, everything is equal, but then they would not mean it individually. It logically does not make sense for you to refer to a stranger as your son, as your father, just because this is what the government is pushing for you to adapt. It doesn't make sense logically. In Plato's Republic, the idea is that if you don't know who is your father, if you don't know who is your son, and if the children is raised in a state-run, let's say, communities where no one knows who's the real father, who's the real son, then you would treat every citizen, for example, random person that you see in the street, as your own son, as your own father, as your own mother, because you wouldn't be able to distinguish. You wouldn't want to hurt someone else, let's say, commit a crime, if you believe that there is a certain chance that this random person is my mother or father. But Aristotle says, okay, fair enough, but it doesn't make sense logically. How can you refer to someone random? You don't know individually in your brain who is this person, but then the government pushes for you to adapt this viewpoint that, hey, treat that person as your own father, as your own mother. It doesn't make sense logically, even if that was the more choice for the option. It is like fooling yourself because it's not based on factual evidence. Idea of artificial family bonds doesn't create true emotional attachment. And there is a nice quote that says, the formula is harmful in another way. What belongs in common to the most people is accorded the least care. They take thought for their own things above all, and less about things in common, or only so much as falls to each individually. People care less for what is common to all. This is the problem of free riding. Everyone expects that someone else will take responsibility. And that's what happens when you share things with other people, when you share everything. So, okay, let's say there's this thing that, let's call it one property where everyone is entitled to. It's a common property. But at the end of the day, someone has to take care of this property. Someone has to work on it. Someone has to make it into something meaningful so that it can be maintained. He's warning that in these scenarios, since this is a common property, people will not take that much higher care of this thing. And there will be people free riding. They will say, doesn't matter, even if I don't take care of this, someone else will do it on my behalf. And think about this. If everyone had that mentality, then that thing that people share would not be maintained and at the end would be destroyed. And that is his strong argument against sharing things in common, sharing property in common. There is this danger of free riding where you will assume that someone else will take care of it, someone else will maintain it, since this is a common property. But if everyone had this thought, then no one would maintain it. But usually, if you own something privately, if this is something that you own, if let's say a human being is your son, father, mother, you will take higher care towards them. There is an emotional attachment, natural emotional attachment. And here Aristotle says that Socrates skips that part, or at least doesn't take that into consideration. In theory, in paper, it may sound good, although it also says that it's not possible because it's not based on factual evidence to call random stranger your mother, father. But even if it was possible, still, this doesn't work in practice because of human nature. Humans seek connection, recognition, ego. human beings have an ego. They'll eventually find out who their real relatives are, who's the real mother, who's the real father in a society. I think it's interesting if you go back, if you go forward 2,000 years and even more. I think Dostoevsky says something very similar. He said in one of his books that even if everything is rational and carefully planned and great, there is no room for any problem, then human beings would break the system just to have something interesting. Same applies here. You may believe that even if you, as a state, if you push this idea to the people that, okay, children will be raised in common households, no one will know who's the real father, who's the real mother, who's the real son. And as a result, when you see a random stranger in the city, in the street, you will think that, oh, maybe this person is my son, so I will treat that person nicely. But usually that doesn't happen in practice. That may not happen in practice. Also, because of the problem of free riding. You may say, okay, this random stranger, let's say in the street, is starving, but you may believe that, okay, I don't need to help this person because someone else will do it. But if that person was your father or mother or son, you would definitely help because of that personal attachment. And you cannot get rid of these ideas, attachment, these natural feelings of humans just via laws, carefully designed laws and systems, which Plato advocates. The affection arises through known relationships. In Plato's city, where family ties are erased, he also says crime would increase. If no one knows their parent, their child, moral restraint, natural moral restraint that all human societies have declines. And laws alone cannot replace emotional bonds, no matter how careful these laws are designed. In Plato's Republic, there is this idea that there will be specific times during the year when guardians will have sex and will have children. And it will be very specific times. And sexual intercourse between lovers is eliminated because it involves too much pleasure. And then Aristotle jumps back at his teacher by saying, it is also odd that sexual intercourse is eliminated for no other reason than that the pleasure involved is too strong. He's saying it is very strange that sex between lovers is eliminated and it's state controlled, only with the ground that the pleasure is too strong. Why? Why do we make a claim that when there is a pleasure in sex through which offspring is produced, that's bad? Why do we start with the starting point that pleasure is bad? How do we come to this conclusion that if there's a pleasure involved, that's something bad? He says there is no strong argument by Plato or by Socrates when they say we need to eliminate pleasure during the sex. Sex should be rationally governed process aimed at bringing in the offspring that city requires. He's saying, what's the point of this? Why do we decline pleasure? What's wrong with pleasure? In many ways, here Aristotle is very different than other famous Greek philosophers. Even if you can also compare it with Stoicism later on. And it's also very visible if you read his other book, Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that, why do we reject pleasure as something bad? Okay, it's not good if someone is obsessed with getting pleasure, quick pleasures. That's not a feasible long-term solution for a human being to flourish. But the opposite is also not true, that pleasure is bad. We need to get rid of pleasure. Here, Aristotle proposes some alternative. It says, okay, let's first look at the nature, empirical evidence. Pleasure is there. You cannot avoid this. And as long as human beings are there, they have their ego, they have their desires and everything. Pleasure will be one of the goods that they are going to seek. And that's why we cannot avoid this when we talk about building cities and we come up with something very contrary to the human nature and say that, pleasure is bad. And that's why when you have having a sex, there should be no pleasure. And that's why we need to eliminate sex between lovers because there is a pleasure involved. And here it says there is no apparent reason why Socrates proposes this. What purpose does it serve? Why pleasure is bad? There is another claim where he says, okay, we take it for granted that affection towards human beings, affection towards your fellow citizens is one of the necessities of a successful city, successful community. But in a city where no one knows who's their father, mother, son, daughter, affection will necessarily be destroyed. Whereas we say that in the city, citizens should be affectionate towards one another, it will produce the opposite effect, unintended consequences. Like, he means that you disrupt the natural progression from household to city with these policies. You may believe that if you get rid of these emotional attachment, people will obey the state more, government more, and then laws will be more effective. But it's not as simple as that, because human beings are complex creatures. They will always have their private desires. They will always prefer their fathers and mothers over strangers when they are deciding whom to help. And you cannot avoid this by saying that, let's get rid of all these notions, mother, father, everyone is your mother, everyone is your father, everyone is your son. Sounds good in theory, but rarely works in practice. First of all, it's very difficult. How can you identify? How can you avoid identifying through other means? You can find a person who looks like similar to you, and you may start guessing, okay, this person might be my son, might be my father that got separated from me via state. But there are ways to find out about this. It's not practically feasible. And again, why we assume pleasure is a problem, especially when it fosters natural affection. And two people love each other and then they have an offspring. Why do we assume that that's bad? Why do we assume that sex should be something very rational? For there are two things above all which make human beings cherish and feel affection: what is one's own and what is dear. And neither of these can be available to those who govern themselves in this way. Further, what was mentioned before must necessarily result above all in these cases, that is, assaults, love affairs, murders, for those who have been assigned to the other class of citizens, will no longer address the guardians as brothers, children, fathers, or mothers. Okay, to summarize this part, before we go into discussing about property, common property or private properties, is that first of all, before we create theories, we first need to look at the empirical evidence. We need to look at the human nature. Do human communities naturally gravitate towards more unity or less unity, more diversity or less diversity in terms of thought, skills, abilities, and everything? He says that this is obvious because we start with household, then we go to village, and then we go to city. In a household, it is very unified, where there is one family. Most likely, they have very similar interests. There is not much diversity happening there because they do the same things. They eat the same food. They share their clothes. They share their property. But as this goes into village and then city, as these communities extend further, more diversity emerges. There are people that that deal with different arts, different trades, and they trade with each other. That's why we cannot force unity, extreme centralization in these cities. That's unnatural. And we cannot assume that if human beings share families, share children, share wives, husbands, that it will end up in a desired effect. Because human beings are complex individuals, they have their egos and everything else associated with it. Another topic that Aristotle touches upon is property. Should property be common or private? What is the difference between owning property versus using it? Says having all property in common involves many risks and difficulties because living together and sharing things are very difficult because people quarrel over even small tribal things and break apart. There is always also a possibility of resentment. Let's take, for example, one single farm. If there is a perception that someone is working less there but benefiting more, it will lead to resentment of others who work more. So if in cases, in situations where property is shared, there is going to be a lot of million type of problems between those people that share these things. Some people will accuse others for fear riding. Someone will accuse others for not maintaining it, not doing their fair share. So whenever there is a sharing element involved between different human beings, there is always going to be a problem. And what's the solution? Should we get rid of all common properties? Should property be strictly private or should it be controlled by state? in saying these things, it's very interesting that he's also comparing free market capitalism versus communism as was understood in the 20th century. And that's what makes Aristotle very relevant, that even though more than 2000 years has passed, you can see that he's touching upon these topics, which is still debated even today between politicians, philosophers, thinkers. A lot of wars have been fought, a lot of experiments have been tried. Soviet Union, for example, and he's talking about these topics, which makes them relevant even for the last century. But putting that aside, what is Aristotle's solution? He says generally property should be private but common in use. And he's saying that in finely administered cities, it is possible to come up with some arrangement where even though property is private, sometimes common use is allowed under certain conditions. And it is the task of great politician, great governor, to create laws, to take a great legislator, to find a good balance here between private ownership of property while also allowing common use of the property. So he's not saying there should be communism, and he's also not saying that there should be full libertarian free market capitalism. It's more similar to mixed economies that already exist in the 21st century that we live in. No abolishment of private property, but also no full enactment of private property. It's more of a compromise. Private ownership with common use in some cases. And in that sense, he's saying laws should encourage generosity for people without enforcing equality of outcome, equality of possessions. It is up to the government, it is up to the great legislator to instill laws that would make people more generous. That is more preferable approach than just getting all their private properties, just confiscating all their private properties and distributing it equally. Not because it would be more moral, but it would also not work in practice. Because he's saying, again, as we mentioned it earlier, that there is going to be a free rider problem when people share a property, when people share things with other people, and people take the most care for the things that they own, that the things that they attach themselves into, personal emotional attachment. Doesn't matter if it is your personal relationship or if it's your personal property. Same logic applies here. It says we cannot get rid of that part about human nature. Because humans have desires. They have ego. We cannot get rid of this. Of course, he talks more about these ethical dilemmas in his other great work, Nicomachean Ethics. But he also makes a reference to that, to many of the ideas that he discusses in the ethics. And that's a very key element of Aristotelian ethics. Okay, if you eliminate any reason for being afraid of something, then you cannot call a person courageous. Courageous person is the one who is actually afraid of something, but still chooses to do it because he considers courage as ultimate virtue. Same thing can be applied to the use of property as well. Getting rich, being generous with one's funds and everything. Generous person is the one who actually is selfish. They're self-interested, but then they consciously choose to be generous and help others because they consider generosity bigger virtue. So in a way, naturally, this is more preferable, according to Aristotle, is that I may be self-interested. This may be my first starting point, but I will choose to be generous because this is more virtuous. He's saying you cannot get rid of these. If you get rid of these self-interest element from human beings, you cannot call these people courageous or generous. Generous person is the one who has self-interest, who acknowledges their self-interest, but then they also choose to help others, donate to others. That is what makes those people generous. And I think in the Nicomachean Ethics, he also gives an example of soldier sacrificing himself to help his country. He says, if you get rid of the fear of death from that person, there is no ground for this person to show his courage. Courageous person would be the one that loves life, is afraid of death, doesn't want to die, but still he may choose to perform this sacrifice because if he considers saving his nation, his country at the war, more virtuous activity. So human nature is there. You cannot get rid of human nature. People will always be self-interested. But then what makes person more virtuous or less virtuous is the choice they make. This is according to Aristotle more virtuous. Virtue requires a choice. A generous person isn't the one who owns nothing or poor, but one who is rich and chooses to share. And it is the job of the legislator, governor, to make sure that to educate people in a way that they become more generous, more courageous, more virtuous. Another point of disagreement. Aristotle criticizes dividing masses and guardians because in the Plato's Republic there are strict hierarchies between classes. Like if you are a guardian, your child will be guardian. They will be raised separately from the other people. But Aristotle says, will it not result in city being divided into two camps, elites and common people? Plato's first claim was to create unity, but with these strict class hierarchies, there will be two parts, two camps in one city. This will not even result in unity if this is what you were after in the first place. And Socrates assumes that through education, there will be no need for conflicts, lawsuits, and because through education, people will understand the perfect form, perfect nature of the things. They will be more enlightened, more wise, and that's why there will be no need for conflicts and other undesirable elements. But it's also really odd that in Plato's Republic, only guardians will get the education. And he's criticizing in this sense that, okay, you're only providing education for guardians, but what about the other parts of the city? How will you ensure that these people are also enlightened? And Socrates makes a claim that his purpose is not to make specific parts of population happy, but the city as a whole happy. But Aristotle says it is impossible for a city to be happy if not all, or at least majority of the population is happy. Again, this goes back to what we said earlier, is that city, political community, is the aggregation of its members. It is not a separate, singular entity existing outside of its members. If you want city to be happy, prosperous, you need to make sure that citizens are happy and prosperous, which he considers that it's very much omitted in Plato's Republic, about how these things can work in practice. Happiness is not the same thing as evenness or singularity or perfect union. That was all for today. Book 2, we covered almost half of it. Here, Aristotle criticized mainly his teacher, Plato, his ideas about politics, about a perfect regime that can exist. Essentially, in summary, he is criticizing the first of all that practical feasibility of this project. And then, but he also touches upon that it is not really desirable for city to be unified, like city to be one single entity where everything is the same, everything is shared, people are equal in 100% in terms of their views, their abilities, their skills, their property. He says this is not desirable, but also not practically feasible. But interesting that he is not necessarily making moral claims here. He's approaching these topics from rational point of view. He's saying, okay, if we want city to exist, if we want city to emerge and exist in the long term, this cannot work because of several practical reasons. That was all for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you find it interesting, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. If some of the topics seemed foreign to you, check out the previous 2 episodes. Ideas explored in this part builds upon many of the ideas that I explored in the previous chapters. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.